All right, well, thank you again for being here today. We are, I think, in week 3 of our series throughout the summer called Stories. And as I said before, we're just kind of pulling out some just biblical stories, characters, and that sort of thing throughout the summer. And so today's story is going to come from Joseph. It's a pretty big story. We're talking about not Joseph, Jesus' father, but the other Joseph, right? And so Joseph was a guy who we probably know a few things about. And so if I were just to we were in a smaller setting and I said, hey, just tell me what you know. A few of you may say, well, the coat of many colors, right? I don't know why anyone would want a coat of many colors, but for that day and age, it would have been a sign of wealth. It would have been a sign of favoritism, and we'll get to that. But so we think of a coat of many colors. We think of his brothers being jealous of him. We think of him being sold, and we think of him kind of rising through the ranks. Maybe you think of, being falsely accused with Potiphar's wife and that whole situation. So there's a lot of maybe things you kind of pull out of the story. So what is it about the story that we can kind of pull out of? Now, for me, there's a thought that resonates throughout the story. In fact, a lot of these stories, you kind of have some ebbs and flows and hills and valleys and that sort of thing. And so where is God? That's typically our response, right? We're all about, God, here you are on the mountaintop, but it's in the valley where everything's dark and everything's grim and everything seems hopeless. We're like, where are you? And so if you're like me, there's those seasons in life where you're like, oh, God, there you are. And you're like, where are you, God? And so we want to kind of build that faithfulness and steadiness. And so if there's a picture of someone who's steady through it all, we're not talking about the brat that he was when he was young, right? We'll get to that too. But when everything kind of came clear to him and his faithfulness and his commitment to serve the Lord, it's an amazing story. In fact, many scholars would even say he's kind of the Old Testament picture of Jesus, and we'll even kind of touch a little bit on that. So if you're taking notes, you probably look at the notes and you go, there's one line. This is going to be really quick. Pay attention, there's a lot of little lines, right? So we're going to be here as long as it takes. But there's one thought, and we did this kind of strategically because I really want to kind of focus on the story and not the blanks. So here's the main point. Instead of focusing on our problems, let's focus on our purpose. Because it's nature to just focus on what we're going through, especially when it's bad. But there's also easy to focus on the good times, not the problems. It's easy to focus on the victories and say, instead of where is God, it's like, look at me, so where is God in this? And so there's a lot of different ways, but for today's sake, I want us to really just focus on the purpose instead of the problems we might be facing. So whether the problems that we're facing are self-induced, maybe it's a result of our own foolish decisions. Maybe it's a result of our own just intentional sin, something we just struggle with, something we continue to commit. Whatever the case may be, it's a consequence of a sinful choice or decisions we continue to make, or it's a result of someone else's foolishness, someone else's sins, as we talked about last week. Either way, we're going to have seasons of problems. We're going to have seasons of trouble, whether it's financial, relational, all that. What I hope we can see today is that God wants to just tell a story. He wants to tell a beautiful story through your life. He wants to take, if you're here, He wants to take that struggling marriage. He wants to take that and turn it into something beautiful so that down the road you can look back and you can help those who are in the same season that you were in walk through it. He wants that struggle or whatever that season you're in, that you're facing some doubts, you're trying to find God, you're trying to find God in this, you're trying to figure out what is God trying to do, that maybe He's still working, maybe He's still speaking, but you're just so focused on the problem, you're still focused on this, that you're not able to see the big picture, and eventually you're going to look back and say, God was there the whole time. And you're going to be able to look past, and you're going to be able to hopefully walk with someone. God's going to bring someone in your path that's going through the exact same thing, and He's going to help you walk through that. So He is telling a story in your life and through your life. It's all about, am I willing to recognize and look above and beyond my problem in this season, and hopefully see that I may not understand why right now, but I'm going to trust that He's involved and that He is completely engaged. So why did Joseph's brothers hate him so much? Well, if you read the story, you understand that he was the obvious favorite son of his dad, Jacob. We're in the Old Testament, right? So he had other wives. And so Joseph happened to be the son of his favorite wife, Rachel. Again, this isn't relevant today, right? Hopefully. Talk to me if we're having that struggle. But anyway, so this is his favorite wife, Rachel. That's a whole nother story. And then so Joseph is the son between them, and so that's his favorite son, and everybody knew it. So you can kind of imagine what's kind of going on around the house many times, that when the other brothers kind of messed up, at this point there were just 11 of them, but at every point the other brothers were messed up, there was this constant line. Hopefully you've never had to hear this, but why aren't you more like Joseph? You don't have to raise your hands literally, you just go, yeah. I had a brother like that. I had a sister. I was always compared. And so that's another reason. Not that he was just favored, but it was vocal. And then kind of the last straw, through all the years together, they knew that he was the favored son. So the straw that kind of broke the camel's back was they were out working the fields, and it makes a point to say they were out working. Joseph is hanging out with his dad, just doing whatever he wants to do, just playing the PlayStation, whatever. And so he kind of decides, okay, I'm going to get out. But his dad rewards his laziness and favoritism with a new coat. And so the first thing Joseph wants to do is not just hold on to it and put it in his closet. What does he decide to do? He decides to go show off his brothers, right? So he picks the worst possible time. They're out there working, they're sweating, they're tired, and they're probably talking among themselves, where's Joseph? Why isn't he helping? And all of a sudden, he kind of just struts up there with his coat of many colors, which today wouldn't be very cool, but in that day, it was. And he shows up. And they're already just like mad at him. But then he makes it worse. Like he doesn't get the whole context of anything. He doesn't read the room. He says, I had this dream, guys, which he should have kept it to himself. I had this dream. And in the dream, you, my brothers, were bowing down to me. Did any of you have siblings? Right? You had brothers. Imagine if he's my big little brother. He's 6'3". So he's younger, but he's bigger. Thankfully, I moved away from college before he got bigger. That's another story, too. But imagine him coming to me and saying, Brian, I had this dream. One day you're going to bow to me. It wouldn't go well, right? It wouldn't go well. Now, I'm saying that Joseph was annoying, and he deserved a little bit of hazing. He deserved something. But he didn't deserve what was about to happen, and here's where you probably know the story, where they say, you know what? We got to do something. We got to do something. What they wanted to do was just take him out. But thankfully, one of the brothers stepped in. I think it was Reuben, and said, no, we can't do that. So they kind of beat him up, took his coat, and then some, people come through, these gypsies come through, and he sells Joseph to them, who eventually sells him to the Egyptians. And they go and they take this coat of many colors, dip it in some blood, and they take it back to Dad and say, he's dead. Your favorite son is dead. I don't know if they were smirking. I don't know what the presentation was like, but they presented this coat, and obviously Jacob was just brokenhearted. The brothers like, okay, we don't have to hear about him anymore. And then all of a sudden you kind of fast forward to the story. We pick it up in Genesis chapter 33. There's a statement, there's a phrase that appears early in the story that I want to really focus on. In fact, it shows up in chapter 39 4 different times, and the phrase is this: the Lord was with Joseph. And I want you to kind of think about it. You imagine what he's going through. He was annoying. He was a little brat, but he didn't deserve what happened to him. And so whatever you're going through, whether it's a consequence of your own doing or someone else's doing, you may not deserve what you're going through. But I want you to hear what is happening in the midst of what Joseph is going through, because it relates to us here today. Look at verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. Now, the Egyptian master's name would have been Potiphar at that time, and he's working, and he's a slave, but it says he was successful. And in verse 3 it says his master saw that the Lord was with him, Joseph, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Potiphar recognized, not only did Joseph recognize that the Lord was with him, but all of a sudden Potiphar who's worshiping multiple gods, recognizes that, okay, whatever God he's serving has his hand on him. Something's different about this guy. He's not just kind of just sour grapes. He's not just pouting. I know his story. If he's here as a slave, he has an ugly story, but you know what? I see the Lord's hand on him, and so he recognized that. And then you kind of fast forward, God is setting him up, and then all of a sudden he's walking through the hallway. We're not getting into the details, but he's walking through the hallway. Potiphar's wife falsely accuses him of something, and obviously Potiphar believes his wife instead of his servant, rightfully so, right? And so he throws Joseph into prison. He was innocent, didn't do anything wrong, but he's in prison. And then this is where we pick up the next time we see the phrase in verse 21, same chapter, Genesis 39. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Now, that's a sermon in and of itself, where in the midst of prison, where he's there because he's innocent. It's not just bad enough to be sold into slavery, away from his family, away from everything he knows, and all of a sudden he's working, he's just doing his thing, and all of a sudden he's falsely accused, and there he's in prison with no hope of escape. But the Lord was with Joseph, and I love this, showed him steadfast love. Can you imagine the intimacy that had to be happening between God and Joseph in that time? And if you've been there in your darkest valley, in that time where you wondered if God is even there, and everyone and everything has abandoned you, and you wonder if God is even there, if you'll just look up, if you'll just gaze and wonder, God has a way of loving us more intimately when we are most desperate for Him. So if you're in that valley, if you're in that season, wonder if God, I just beg you, I plead that you just look up and say, God, show me your love. And I promise you, I guarantee you, He will step in. He doesn't mean He's going to fix that situation right now, but He will be in that cell with you. He will be in that valley with you, just like He was with Joseph. And then we jump down to verse 23. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because what? The Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. So again, you have Potiphar recognize something different about this guy. And then fast forward, you're in prison. The warden says, man, there's something different about this guy. He wasn't moping. He wasn't pouting. He was just, wasn't saying, he was like, man, I love it here. I guarantee you wasn't in prison. I guarantee you wasn't a slave going, I love my job. I love this season. But there was something about him. He found joy in the midst of that season. And people around him recognized him. Why? Because the Lord was with him. So kind of just in the midst of him being in prison, God gave him a kind of ability and a gift to not just have dreams, but interpret dreams. And so people began to hear about this, and a couple of people, prisoners, came to him. They said, okay, we were this and that, to begin to lay out the story. Joseph helps them. In fact, to find them innocent. It wasn't them. And so he said, well, when you go before Pharaoh, when you go before those in charge, will you just speak on my behalf and get me out of here? Because just like you were falsely accused and you're in here innocent and I'm helping you get out, will you remember me so I can get out because I was innocent too? They made him that promise. Have you ever been promised something from someone and they didn't follow through? That's what happened to him. So he's doing all this good. Everything is going well. He's doing what he's supposed to do. He's faithful to the Lord. He's being a good citizen. He's being a good person. And then all of a sudden they get out. They have the opportunity to speak on his behalf, but they don't. And so he stays in prison for 2 more years. Can you just kind of settle for a second? I know time flies right now, but he's in prison 2 more years, knowing that he should be out by now. But he's still faithful. He's still focused on the Lord. And so now we fast forward. He finally gets out. We fast forward, and now we're in the story where we're 20 years later, since the moment where his brothers decide to sell him literally out. And then all of a sudden, we're 20 years later, where Joseph has another dream. And he dreams that there's going to be this great famine. And he's in a place in Egypt where he's the second in command of all of Egypt. And he has this vision, and he goes to Pharaoh and says, hey, this is going to happen. There's going to be a 7-year famine. So I think the math, at least for me, is we have a few years to prepare for this. God said it's coming, and he's shown me, so let's prepare. So in 7 years, before the famine starts, he begins to collect grain. I mean, they're doing their thing, but he rations it out. He plans it out, and he's just stockpiling grain so that Egypt can be taken care of. And it's just abundance, and that's how the Lord kind of works. It's just abundant for all those years, and all of a sudden the famine hits, and you know who it begins to affect? Not just everyone in the region, but all of a sudden his family is affected. And Jacob turns to his brother and says, hey guys, we're low on grain. We don't have anything to eat. We hear that Egypt, some guy up there, had the vision and the fortitude to be able to plan ahead. So that's the only grain around. Why don't you guys, a few of you boys, go see him and see if we can buy some grain? So they show up. You can imagine the number of people there. And they finally make their way in front of Joseph himself, because he's the guy that they have to go through to be able to get the grain. So now Joseph recognizes them, but because now he's Egyptian, right? And he's kind of just in his garments, and he's got makeup on because that's what they did in that day. So he looks nothing like them. He looks nothing like they remembered. They assume that he's dead. They assume that he's working somewhere in prison. He's working as a slave somewhere if he's still alive. The last place they assumed he would be was in that position. And here's the neat, this is the first time these few brothers come and they bow before him, because that's what they did. And you kind of think back, he probably remembers this dream. He says, there they are. And he begins to have this discussion with them, and he begins to say, okay, well, these guys are here. I'm going to play along. And so he hides his identity, and he wants to test his brothers. So he says to them, I understand you probably have more brothers. They say, yes. Well, I understand you probably have a younger brother. And Benjamin was the youngest brother. And then this was another favored son, because he was also the son of the wife Rachel of Jacob's, the same mother that Joseph had. He says, I want you to go back. I'm going to give you this grain, but I want you to go back. I want you to bring Benjamin with you. So they go back, and they present this plan, this condition to their father, and naturally he said no. There's no way I'm going to risk sending my second favorite son now to go with you boys, because the other one didn't come back. So there's no way. Well, you kind of wait out. As long as that grain lasted, that's how long this period lasted. But all of a sudden the grain's going low, and the brothers, hey, we've got to go back. And then all of a sudden we kind of pick up the story where Judah speaks up to his father, and he makes this vow. We're fast forwarding now to Genesis chapter 43, verses 8 through 9. This is Judah speaking to Jacob, the father. Send the boy along with me, and we will go at once, so that we and you and our children may live and not die. I myself will guarantee his safety. You can hold me personally responsible for him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him here before you, I will bear the blame before you all of my life. So Jacob finally says, okay, my youngest boy Benjamin's going to die if we don't feed him. So why don't you take Benjamin, all of you boys go together to watch out for him. Go get some food and then bring it back. So all of a sudden, all the boys show up. They show up and they bow again before Joseph. Although this time, he decides, I'm going to throw this big banquet, this elaborate party for them. You can imagine they're kind of caught off guard. But what he was really trying to do is test them. What he really wanted to do, now that he had Benjamin here, he was testing them to see how are they treating Benjamin. Because if they treated him anything like they treated me, then there's no way. And I'm thinking in the back of Joseph's mind, he's like, man, I don't know what I'm going to do with these guys. Because he had the power to do anything he wanted to. So he's just kind of testing them. He's allowing God to kind of work and show him, give him wisdom, not just act out of just natural reaction and vengeance. So he watches over the dinner party. I can imagine Joseph. Everybody's eating, everybody's hanging out, and Joseph's just kind of walking around. He's probably asking questions like, so did you have any other brothers? Oh, Joseph. Now, what happened to him, right? And all of a sudden, it all begins to come out. And what he begins to see, though, is not only were they kind and nice to young Benjamin, they were also, when Joseph came up somehow, probably because Joseph threw it in there somehow, that he figured out and found out that they were remorseful now. They were sorry for what had happened. And all of a sudden, he began to be stirred. So he says, okay, I'm going to give a final test. So the next day, they wake up, the party's over, and he says, okay, I'm going to send you away with grain. And so what he does, he has all of his officials and all of his workers just pile on the donkey as much grain as they could carry. And then the money they brought to pay for the grain, he puts the money back in the pouches where the grain is with each and every one of them. So not only are they leaving with more grain than they could afford, but they're leaving with the money that they came to buy the grain with, not knowing what was happening. But on top of that, the big test was he takes this silver cup, which is very valuable, and he hides it in the satchel of young Benjamin, and he sends him off. That's dirty right there. That is dirty. If you don't know the rest of the story, you're like, man, Joseph, he's a bad dude. Well, here's what happened. So he sends officials. He says, I think these guys stole something. Look at them. They're running like they stole something. Go catch them. Check them out. If they've stolen anything, bring them back to me because I'm going to take care of them. They go, they found the money in the pouches, but then they found the silver cup in Benjamin's pouch. And the brothers are looking around going, what? You know, you can imagine all the accusation that's probably going on. What were you thinking? You know, all this sort of thing. But they bring Benjamin back, and he's about to lay down this sentence on him. And all the officials are there. And then all of a sudden, Judah, who told his dad that he would protect him, has this moment of, what am I going to do? And Joseph has this moment of, what are they going to do? Are they going to sell him out like they sold me out? Are they going to throw him under the bus? How are they going to handle this? It's either his life or theirs, because they knew that if they confessed to the crime, what power this man had. And they knew also that they promised their dad, and they knew what they had done many, many years ago. So they've got all this stuff going through their minds, and they're probably thinking, you reap what you sow. We're getting what we deserve, and then nobody speaks up until Judah speaks up, and he says, I want to have a private conversation. Joseph with, obviously he didn't know his name, but he says, with Joseph, I want just us to talk. So Joseph lets everybody go. And in Genesis 44, 32 through 34, Judah pleads for Benjamin's release. He says, your servant guaranteed the boy's safety to my father. I said, if I do not bring him back to you, I will bear the blame before you, my father, all my life. Now then, please let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy. And let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see the misery that would come upon my father. Can you imagine for a moment what Joseph must have thought? I can't help, even as faithful to the Lord as he was, I can't help but think he's still having doubts about his brothers. He's still wondering, are they really different? Have they really grown up? And all of a sudden, this happens. And so the few people that had remained because they were close to Joseph and his translators in the room at this point, he says, I want everybody to leave. So he excuses everyone, including his translator, because up to this point, he had been speaking Egyptian to his brothers. They assumed that he was Egyptian. They just knew there's no way this could be our brother. It was nowhere on their radar. And so he excuses everyone. They're wondering what happens. And then all of a sudden in verse 3, he comes clean with who he is. It's just simple. He says, I am Joseph. And in that very moment, Their heads bowed, not out of respect, because that's how they've been bowing their heads to that point, because this Egyptian guy, we want the grain, this is all for our life, this is what we're doing, we're bowing out of respect. They're bowing now out of fear. And imagine yourself in just that place where you literally sold this man into slavery 20 years ago. And you've had to live with it all this time. And maybe because since they're so nice to young Benjamin, maybe they're trying to make up for what they did all these years ago. But now they stand before their brother, who they assume to be dead by now, and they're going, now he has the power to take us out. Now he has the power to just avenge everything that we did to him. I can imagine there's a long silence that filled that room. Joseph probably had no idea what to say next. The brothers knew they better not look up. They're probably wondering, when are the guards coming in? You think? What's going to happen? As time passes, they begin to realize nothing is going to happen. And I want you to get this, because some of you can relate to this, because you have somebody who's hurt you. You have somebody that maybe that's hurting you. And all you want is vengeance. But Scripture is clear that vengeance is mine, says the Lord. So on this day, when they deserved vengeance, when they deserved judgment, they received grace. Because the moment he comes clean about who he is, he said this in verse 5. And now, do not be distressed. Can you imagine how stressed they were? Do not be distressed. And do not be angry with yourselves. I love this. He says, quit feeling sorry for you. Remove the guilt. Yes, you are guilty, but I don't condemn you any longer. He says, for selling me here. Why? Because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. You talk about perspective. We go back to our main thought. What do we say? Instead of focusing on our problems, let's focus on the purpose. All of a sudden, through all those years in slavery and then in prison and then back up the ladder he climbed again, all of a sudden he's at a place where he begins to see God wasn't planning, right? And this is what I want you to see. It wasn't like God was planning for him to be sold into slavery. But God took what happened, because it didn't catch God off guard, and he said, I'm going to make a beautiful story out of this. Here's an interesting note. Judah was the brother, right, who stepped up and stepped in. It was out of Judah's descendants, many, many years later, that there was the one true innocent human that was born of the Virgin Mary. And he was truly innocent, sin-free, and he stood in the gap for you, and he stood in the gap for me. Guys, you may not have sold your brother into slavery, but you and I deserve death. We don't deserve grace. That's what it means. It's unmerited favor. The myth is this, and I'm wrapping up with this. The myth is that contentment begins with understanding why. And why this is important is, some of us here today, there's times where we feel like we're not going to be content until we know why. We're not going to let this go until we know why. We're not going to accept this until we know why. But the truth is this, is that contentment begins with asking how God might use this for His glory. You may not deserve what you're going through, but you're going through it. And so instead of just focusing on and whining and pouting, there's probably a time for that. I'm not saying you can't cry, you can't weep, you can't grieve. I'm just saying at some point we've got to just quit focusing on this and see it for what this is and say, okay, God, I'm in this. So how are you going to tell a beautiful story through this? How are people going to see how good you are through this? Instead of focusing on our problems, let's focus on our purpose. Will you bow your heads with me? God, I thank you. I thank you for this wonderful, beautiful truth in the midst of this powerful story. I thank you that you recorded stories like this so that we can be encouraged, so that we can be filled with hope. That our pain, our struggles, our frustrations are not in vain when we are focused on you. Because we see that you were with Joseph. So since you were with Joseph, he is not more important than us. So that means you are with us. So I pray that you give us the courage to trust you without understanding the why. If you're here today and you don't know the Lord Jesus Christ as your personal Savior, and you see Joseph's story as a beautiful picture of redemption, and you see yourselves not as Joseph needing to forgive someone, but you see yourself as one of those brothers begging and pleading for mercy, then God has that ready for you right now. He doesn't want to condemn you today. He wants to show compassion on you. So if you're here today, you want to receive His compassion, receive His grace, I'd love to lead you in a prayer and invite Jesus into your life. If that's you here today, would you just lift your hand? You want to invite Jesus into your life today? Anyone?